On certain mornings in history, the sky becomes more than a battlefield. It becomes a stage where the limits of human engineering, human instinct, and human courage collide in ways no doctrine can predict. One such morning arrived over the German industrial city of Schweinfurt, when a single encounter rewrote the mathematics of air combat and forced some of the most experienced pilots in the world to confront a truth they had never imagined possible. Before we enter that moment, if you enjoy deep historical storytelling crafted with precision and care, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next journey into the past. The sun had barely cleared the horizon on the 19th of August in the year 1943, when Franz Stigler suspended 27,000 feet above. Schweinfurt pulled back on the control stick of his Messerschmitt Bf 109 and felt the airframe tremble in the thin atmosphere. Up here, every motion became sluggish, every correction demanded anticipation rather than reaction, and every choice carried consequences that could unfold in seconds. Below him, a long column of American B-17 flying fortresses droned eastward, their white contrails scraping across the darker patchwork of earth beneath. Stigler had flown 174 combat missions, and experience had etched a simple truth into his mind. Altitude created energy, and energy created possibilities. Whoever held the vertical dimension dictated the terms of the fight. This doctrine had shaped his instincts for years. The Luftwaffe had taught it. Physics had confirmed it. Survival had enforced it. That morning, however, something appeared in the sky that threatened the very foundations of that certainty. From below, 4 sleek silhouettes began climbing toward his position. Twin booms, wide wings, and unmistakable American lines marked them as Lockheed P-38 Lightning's aircraft. His intelligence officers had dismissed as heavy reconnaissance platforms or light bombers. The briefings had been clear. Twin-engine fighters could not outclimb or outmaneuver a well-positioned Bf 109. Stigler, holding a comfortable 3,000 feet of altitude advantage, and the sun at his back, prepared for a textbook diving attack. He rolled gently into a shallow dive, letting gravity feed his acceleration, expecting the 4 machines to scatter once they recognized his descending threat. Instead, he watched something that defied every rule he had internalized. The lead P-38 did not break formation. It did not dive to gain speed. It did not bank sharply or turn to offer a defensive profile. Instead, its nose lifted not gradually but with the kind of sudden impossible authority that suggested the laws of physics themselves were bending. The American fighter climbed at an angle that looked nearly vertical, swallowing altitude at a rate of roughly 3,300 feet per minute. In less than 1 minute, Stigler's hard-earned altitude advantage evaporated. By the 1-minute mark, the P-38 was above him, rolling inverted and preparing to convert its newfound altitude into a diving attack of its own. That shocking maneuver, witnessed by a veteran who believed he had seen everything air combat could offer, became the doorway into a deeper truth. The moment could not be brushed aside as a fluke. It was the product of a machine built not from incremental improvement but from first principles engineering that had ignored every conventional assumption about fighter design. To understand the weight of that moment, one must understand the world Stigler inhabited. When German forces crossed into Poland on the 1st of September in the year 1939, the Luftwaffe deployed approximately 4,000 combat aircraft. The Messerschmitt Bf 109E model, known as the Emil, represented nearly 1 decade of focused refinement. Its Daimler-Benz 601 engine provided 1,175 horsepower and pushed the machine to roughly 354 miles per hour. At low to medium altitudes, it climbed at nearly 3,000 feet per minute. These figures were not theoretical. They were proven in the skies of the Spanish Civil War, where German engineers learned how to perfect the fighter under real combat conditions. This technological maturity allowed Germany to dominate the early years of the war. Poland collapsed in 5 weeks. France, despite fielding more tanks and possessing a larger army, fell in 6 weeks, largely because German air power shattered defensive coordination. Even against the Royal Air Force flying the outstanding Supermarine Spitfire, German pilots held their ground. By the year 1941, the Bf 109 had become the benchmark by which other fighters were judged. When the Gustav series arrived in 1942, confidence only grew. More power, better armament, sharper aerodynamics. Luftwaffe pilots had fought Britain's best-faced thousands of Soviet aircraft and survived. In comparison, the early American fighters they encountered, the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk and the Bell P-39 Airacobra, seemed unimpressive. The Warhawk lost power above 15,000 feet. The Airacobra's rear-mounted engine caused deadly spins. Soviet pilots who received these designs through Lend-Lease quickly learned to avoid high-altitude combat entirely. To German eyes, American fighters seemed crude, plentiful, but unsophisticated. This belief extended into broader assumptions about American industry itself. German engineering culture prized precision and methodical evolution. The Bf 109 accumulated dozens of carefully tuned variants. The Focke-Wulf 190 became a complementary design, not a replacement. American development, by contrast, appeared chaotic, driven by corporate rivalry and simultaneous conflicting concepts. Then, in 1937, the United States Army Air Corps issued Circular Proposal X608, a request for a high-altitude interceptor that seemed to violate basic logic. The aircraft had to reach 20,000 feet in 6 minutes, achieve 400 miles per hour, carry heavy guns, and fly far enough for extended missions. High speed demanded low weight and low drag. Long range demanded heavy fuel loads. Turbos and weapons added even more weight. No engineer saw a way to meet all requirements simultaneously. No engineer except one. Clarence Leonard Johnson, known universally as Kelly Johnson, refused to begin with existing templates. At age 33, he approached the problem by asking a radical question: what would an aircraft look like if it were designed entirely around these requirements? The answer was unlike any fighter before it. 2 engines, 2 booms, 1 central pod, concentrated nose armament, and a pair of General Electric turbochargers, one for each Allison V1710 engine, ensuring full power at altitudes where other fighters gasped for air. The twin-engine layout solved multiple problems at once. 2 engines produced between 2,600 and 3,200 combined horsepower. Redundancy meant the aircraft could survive the loss of 1 engine. The central fuselage could hold fuel and weapons without the convergence issues that plagued wing-mounted guns. The configuration created new aerodynamic challenges, but Johnson's team spent 2 years solving them. On the 27th of January in the year 1939, the XP-38 prototype took flight. Despite its short test flight, the machine revealed extraordinary potential. 2 weeks later, a transcontinental record attempt ended in a crash caused by fuel mismanagement, destroying the prototype. Yet, instead of cancelling the concept, the Army ordered 13 pre-production aircraft. Testing revealed breathtaking performance, a top speed of 413 miles per hour at 25,000 feet, a service ceiling of 39,000 feet, and a climb rate matching the astonishing 3,300 feet per minute that Franz Stigler would later witness in combat. The aircraft did suffer from compressibility issues during steep dives, creating shock waves that locked the controls. Several test pilots died before dive recovery flaps were added to mitigate the danger. The complexity of the P-38 made it expensive and maintenance-intensive. Only fewer than 100 existed when the attack on Pearl Harbor drew the United States fully into the war. Yet once American pilots began flying it in combat, especially in the Pacific, its value became undeniable. Its blend of speed, firepower, and climb allowed aces such as Richard Bong and Thomas Maguire to dominate the skies. Meanwhile, over Europe, the American 8th Air Force fought to prove the concept of daylight strategic bombing. The theory insisted that tight formations of heavily armed bombers could fight their way to targets and back without escorts. Reality disagreed. German controllers positioned Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s in coordinated waves, exploiting every blind spot of the bomber formations. Armored assault variants of the 190 closed in with 30mm cannon and tore apart the flying fortresses as if they were made of canvas. On the 17th of August in the year 1943, during the Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission, 376 American bombers were sent into the heart of Germany. 60 were shot down. 55 more were damaged beyond repair. More than 600 aircrew were killed or captured. With escort fighters unable to accompany bombers deep into German territory, the loss rate approached 20%. The arrival of the improved P-38H model in England changed everything. Equipped with better turbochargers, refined engines and dive flaps, these long-range escorts could finally reach Berlin with drop tanks covering roughly 575 miles of combat radius. However, range alone would have meant nothing if the aircraft could not fight when it arrived. German intelligence evaluated the twin-engine fighter and concluded it must be heavy and slow at altitude. Doctrine insisted that single-engine fighters diving from above would always win. They were wrong. Everything Franz Stigler had been taught crumbled the moment he watched the P-38 climb through his attack. It was not supposed to happen. It was not supposed to be possible. Yet it happened, and it forced the Luftwaffe to face a harsh new truth. American engineering had not tried to build a slightly improved version of the Messerschmitt. It had solved an entirely different problem, one the German designers had never prioritized. And as the war pressed on, that difference would become the deciding factor in the struggle for control of the European sky. Inside German intelligence offices, the P-38 did not look like a revolutionary machine. On paper, it looked like a familiar type, a twin-engine fighter, roughly 7 tons of combat weight compared to barely 3 tons for a lean Messerschmitt Bf-109. Doctrine forged by years of experience said that twin-engine fighters were inherently slower to climb, less agile in combat, and doomed whenever they entered a fight beneath a single-engine interceptor. Those assumptions were not born of arrogance alone. They reflected real engineering trade-offs and real combat encounters with heavy British and Soviet twins. Yet over Schweinfurt and Regensburg, those deeply rooted beliefs met a machine that did not fit the old categories, and the result was confusion on the ground and shock in the air. The mission itself was ambitious even by the standards of the American 8th Air Force. One stream of roughly 230 B-17 Flying Fortresses was directed toward the ball-bearing plants in Schweinfurt factories, whose products fed the gears and axles of the German war machine. A second force of about 146 bombers aimed for the Messerschmitt facility at Regensburg, the very plant that produced the Bf-109. The Regensburg group was tasked to continue onward after bombing flying south to land in North Africa in a shuttle mission that would complicate German defences. As the streams assembled over England and began their long journey, German radar stations traced their progress plotting height and heading. Controllers reading the sky as if it were a chessboard, scrambled roughly 300 fighters to converge on the routes. Among the units ordered to intercept was Fighter Wing 27 based near Munich. Franz Stigler joined the scramble with the quiet familiarity of a man who had done so many times before. He was no novice. Campaigns in North Africa and on the Eastern Front had already tested him. 14 victories marked his record, each representing a day when his skills and his aircraft had aligned to put an enemy in his gun sights. Beneath him sat the Bf-109 G6, powered by the Daimler-Benz 605 engine, a machine with ferocious climb and acceleration at low and medium altitudes, and with a focused battery of cannon and machine guns that could strip a bomber apart in a single well-placed pass. Stigler also knew the limits of his mount. Above roughly 25,000 feet, the mechanically supercharged engine began to lose its sharp edge. Climb slowed. Turn response grew mushy as the air thinned. Doctrine compensated for these weaknesses by insisting that pilots secure altitude before the enemy arrived, then trade that altitude for speed in a diving attack. Done correctly, it allowed a German fighter to hit a heavier foe with a burst of overwhelming energy, then extend away before the enemy could respond, climbing back up to repeat the process. It was a rhythm almost every experienced pilot in the Luftwaffe knew by heart. By the time Stigler reached 27,000 feet above Schweinfurt, the rhythm seemed set. Below, the first waves of B-17s had already taken hits from other German units. Flashes marked exploding shells and burning engines. The bomber stream strained to hold formation in the face of mounting damage. From this vantage, the task was clear. Dive in, scatter the defenders, and then hunt stragglers. It was at that moment, scanning for escorts, that Stigler noticed 4 shapes climbing from beneath the bomber column. The forms were impossible to misidentify. Twin booms, long central nacelle, characteristic forked tail P-38 Lightnings. Stigler's briefings had mentioned these American fighters, but always with the same tone. Heavy, slow to climb at altitude, better suited to reconnaissance or light attack than to air superiority. Nothing in the files suggested that a pilot in a Bf-109 should feel threatened by a P-38 that began the engagement below him. If anything, they were tempting targets. With the sun at his back, 3,000 feet of altitude in hand, and the enemy beneath him, Stigler seemed to hold every advantage doctrine prized. He rolled gently into a characteristic shallow dive, letting his speed build toward 400 miles per hour. His guns were armed, his angle carefully chosen. In roughly 30 seconds, if nothing unexpected occurred, he would be close enough to fire a burst into the leading American fighter and then slide through the formation ready to climb away and reset. Through his canopy, he could see the P-38 formation below its silver shapes climbing steadily, apparently unaware of the hawk stooping from above. But the lead American pilot, First Lieutenant Virgil Smith, had seen him. From the cockpit of the P-38, looking back through the armored glass, Smith spotted the dark, cross-marked fighter arcing downwards. Every instinct, shaped by conventional wisdom, suggested a familiar response. Break formation, dive away to increase speed and either extend out of range or force the enemy into an extended chase. Instead, Smith did something that must have seemed insane to any observer steeped in earlier doctrine. He held his position with his wingmen and pushed both throttles forward into war emergency power. Under the cowls, the turbocharged Allison engines responded with a surge of power that did not weaken in the thin air. The nose of the Lightning came sharply up. To Stigler's eyes, the sight was surreal. The American fighter was not turning aside, not defending, not fleeing. It was pointing directly into his path, climbing into his attack rather than away from it. That violated everything he had learned about how heavy fighters behaved at such altitudes. As the distance closed from roughly 2,000 feet to 1,000, he found his aim steady on the central nacelle, yet something felt wrong. The apparent rate at which the P-38 grew in his windscreen began to slow, as if an invisible hand were reaching into the equation and meddling with the variables. In the space of a few heartbeats, Stigler could pick out details that no pilot expected to see during a supposed easy bounce. He could distinguish the pilot's helmet, the shape of the canopy frames, the glint of sunlight on the twin booms. Yet the crucial measure, closure speed, was not behaving as the equations predicted. He was diving. The American was climbing. By textbook calculation, their combined velocities should have created a rapid, almost violent merge. Instead, it felt as if the Lightning were meeting him halfway and then continuing upward, refusing to bleed off energy the way every other aircraft he had fought would have done. Numbers that had been abstract in technical manuals now translated into stark reality. At 25,000 feet, the Bf-109 G6 could manage perhaps 2,000 feet of climb per minute, often less if the engine was not perfectly tuned. At the same altitude, the P-38, with its turbochargers maintaining sea-level manifold pressure, could sustain something very close to 3,300 feet per minute. In mathematical terms, the American fighter enjoyed a vertical acceleration that belonged to a different category of machine. Stigler pulled out of his dive at roughly 26,000 feet, his speed advantage spent. The moment that should have seen him streaking past a struggling foe instead left him looking upward at an enemy that had simply climbed through him. He tried to follow, but his mechanically supercharged engine was already off its power peak. Climb rate fell toward 1,500 feet per minute and then lower. Above him, the P-38 continued to gain height, reaching 28,000, then 30,000 feet with disconcerting ease. With altitude now reversed, Virgil Smith did what Stigler had intended to do only moments before. Leveling at 30,000 feet, he rolled the Lightning inverted and tipped the nose down, turning stored potential energy into speed. The dive carried him back toward the German fighter, with the advantage of height and momentum now fully on the American side. Stigler, aware that his only remaining strength lay in the Bf-109's superior turn rate at certain speeds, broke hard to one side, trying to force the engagement into a horizontal contest where wing loading and control responsiveness mattered more than raw climb. Smith refused the invitation. Instead of tightening into a flat turn that would bleed speed, he used the P-38's power to zoom back upward, preserving energy. Again and again, the American pilot transformed altitude into speed dove, to threaten, then climbed away before the German could swing his guns into a stable firing solution. The engagement lasted roughly 6 minutes, a long time for a dogfight at such altitude. During that span, Stigler never achieved the sustained firing opportunity he needed. Each attempt to line up on the Lightning ended with the American either outclimbing him or running away in level flight. Eventually, with fuel and ammunition dwindling, Stigler disengaged, diving toward home. With a realization gnawing at him, he had gone into battle with every advantage he had been taught to seek, and had been driven away without landing a shot. That evening, during the debrief at Fighter Wing 27, he attempted to explain. He described the situation in careful, measured words. They had held higher altitude, he said. They had attacked from above with the sun behind them, and yet the American fighters had climbed straight through their attack. Across the table, the intelligence officer listened with visible skepticism. Twin-engine fighters did not outclimb Bf-109s at altitude. This was supposed to be an article of faith as firm as gravitation. Perhaps the officer suggested the estimation of altitude had been off. Perhaps the American had been diving shallowly, and it only appeared to be climbing. The narrative strained to reinterpret events so that the old rules still held. However, Stigler's report did not stand alone. In the following weeks and months, after-action summaries from other units began to speak of eerily similar encounters. Pilots from another fighter wing reported meeting P-38s at around 26,000 feet, bouncing them from above, and watching them evade by climbing rather than diving. A separate group remarked that the American twin kept its climb performance in the band of altitude, where German fighters began to lose effectiveness, recommending that engagements above 25,000 feet be avoided unless numbers were overwhelmingly in the German favor. One of the most experienced formations in the Luftwaffe concluded that the P-38 should no longer be treated as a heavy fighter at all, but as a machine whose climb and acceleration matched the best single-engine designs. These were not the confused impressions of green airmen. They came from veterans with hundreds of hours in combat, men who could sense energy states almost subconsciously, who had survived duels with Spitfires, Thunderbolts, and every major Soviet type. When such pilots began to write in sober language that the familiar rules of altitude and energy no longer applied in the presence of the P-38, the effect rippled beyond tactics. It reached into the psychological core of a service that had built its identity on early war technical superiority. At first, the response inside the Luftwaffe balanced on a knife edge between denial and reluctant curiosity. A familiar message went out to viewers of any detailed analysis. The story you are hearing is unsettling, but understanding it matters. Within the organization itself, the tone was similar. Senior officers could not simply dismiss the reports as fantasy. There were too many of them from too many different units describing the same phenomenon. Yet to accept the reports fully would mean accepting that fundamental assumptions about fighter design had been wrong. German engineering culture at the time was excellent at refinement. The Daimler-Benz 600 series of engines evolved through numerous carefully engineered variants. The Bf-109 had been tuned through dozens of modifications to address specific issues as they arose. This mindset produced extremely capable machines for the missions Germany expected to fight at the start of the war. It was, however, much less suited to paradigm shifts. The P-38 was not simply a better version of an existing concept. It was a fighter created from a different starting question: how to escort bombers over long distances at high altitude into heavily defended enemy airspace. Because the Luftwaffe had never needed to escort its own bombers on such missions, its designers had never been asked to solve that particular problem. The misreading of the Lightning's capabilities flowed from this gap. External measurements and intelligence photographs confirmed that the P-38 was indeed heavy, close to 7 tons. From the outside, nothing clearly revealed the heart of the design: its turbocharger system. Turbocharging was not a mysterious concept in Germany. Engineers understood the basic principle of using exhaust gases to drive a compressor that forced more air into the engine. What they struggled to achieve was a system that could survive the heat, manage the extreme rotational speeds, and integrate convincingly with engine controls in the harsh realities of combat service. American industry, particularly the engineers of General Electric, had invested years into turning turbochargers from laboratory curiosities into reliable aircraft equipment. Each Allison engine in a P-38 carried its own turbocharger, mounted in the tail boom behind where the structure could help channel and dissipate heat. Plumbing control systems and structural layouts all worked together to allow the engine to maintain sea-level power well above 20,000 feet. German fighter engines, by contrast, relied primarily on mechanically driven superchargers. These provided useful boosts at certain heights, but consumed valuable horsepower and lost effectiveness as altitude increased. Experimental German turbocharged fighters did exist on drawing boards and in a few prototypes, but they suffered chronic problems of overheating control, instability, and weight penalties. Only a handful of high-altitude interceptors, such as certain variants of the Ta-152, ever received anything close to comparable systems, and they arrived too late and in too small numbers to matter. The contrast between the two approaches could be plotted on a simple graph of climb performance. At sea level, a Blef 109G6 might manage around 3,000 feet of climb per minute, a figure that dropped sharply as altitude increased, sinking below 1,000 feet per minute at 30,000 feet. A P-38J model, by comparison, began at roughly 3,300 feet per minute at sea level, and still produced around 3,000 at 15,000 feet and approximately 2,800 at 25,000 feet. In practical terms, the German fighter's performance curve sloped downward like a steep hillside, while the American fighter's curve stayed almost flat until very high altitudes. For pilots like Franz Stigler, that difference was not a theoretical curiosity. It was the invisible force that had turned a perfectly planned attack over Schweinfurt into a bewildering retreat. For the Luftwaffe as an institution, it signaled a deeper challenge. An enemy had changed the shape of the performance envelope itself, and the familiar high ground of the vertical fight no longer belonged exclusively to German pilots. The growing realization that the American twin-engine fighter could dominate the vertical arena forced the Luftwaffe into a posture it had never expected to assume. New directives circulated through fighter wings, written with a tone that betrayed unease behind their formal language. Pilots were instructed to avoid engaging P-38s below 25,000 feet unless they enjoyed overwhelming numerical superiority. They were forbidden from initiating an attack on the American fighter, from beneath it a reversal of long-standing doctrine. If a P-38 gained position above them, they were told not to climb in response but to dive away immediately, abandon the engagement, and attempt to regroup at safer altitudes. A few pilots, unwilling to concede the initiative, so completely attempted to drag the American fighters into slow-turning battles where the tighter horizontal performance of a Blef 109 might impose an advantage. These efforts, however, were improvisations born from weakness rather than expressions of strength, gambles made by men who understood that the sky had changed and that they no longer controlled it the way they once did. The consequences of these doctrinal shifts became painfully clear in the experience of Lieutenant Herbert Huppertz on the 11th of March in the year 1944. Flying near Leipzig, he executed his mission exactly as training demanded. He brought his Bf 109 G14 to 28,000 feet, taking care to secure the altitude advantage essential for a successful attack. Below him at roughly 24,000 feet, 4 P-38s climbed in formation. The situation appeared ideal. Huppertz rolled into a steep dive, reaching speeds around 450 miles per hour, expecting to blast through the formation and climb away before the American pilots could respond. Instead, what he witnessed felt like a replay of Franz Stigler's shock months earlier. The lead P-38, rather than diving defensively, pulled upward into a steep zoom climb, converting forward velocity into altitude so efficiently that it intercepted Huppertz at his own level. In moments, the attacker had become the one under threat. At those heights, the limits of German machinery became painfully obvious. The Bf 109's engine, down roughly 30% of its sea-level power, struggled to keep pace. The American fighter, by contrast, maintained full output thanks to its turbochargers. As the P-38 pilot continued to climb, adjusting position for a deflection shot, Huppertz found himself trapped in the same dilemma that had confronted Stigler. Climbing was impossible. Turning would bleed too much energy. Level flight offered no escape. His only choice was to dive away without firing a single shot. His report, written later with terse precision, mirrored dozens of others encountered P-38 at high altitude, unable to maintain engagement, forced to disengage. This was no longer an anomaly. It had become a pattern. That pattern altered the entire course of the daylight bombing campaign. For the 8th Air Force, long-range escort had been the missing piece in a cruel equation. Without it, bomber groups had suffered losses so severe that the strategy itself seemed unsustainable. With P-38 escorts, however, deep penetration missions became possible again. Loss rates on escorted raids dropped below 5%, while unescorted missions continued to bleed aircraft at rates above 10%. The difference was not merely statistical. Each percentage point represented crews who lived instead of died, machines that returned instead of vanished, and targets that could be struck without sacrificing entire squadrons. Yet the presence of the P-38 did more than protect bombers. It forced the Luftwaffe into a war of attrition it had no hope of winning. German fighters burned precious fuel and ammunition, simply trying to evade or cope with the escorts, often before they could even approach the bomber formations. In the year 1944, German factories produced roughly 40,000 aircraft of all types. American factories, backed by industrial might, unmatched in the world, produced nearly 100,000. Even if every German aircraft had been equal in performance, even if every pilot had survived to fly again, the arithmetic alone would have spelled eventual defeat. In reality, neither condition held true. The pilot situation was even more dire than the industrial one. A German flyer shot down over home territory might parachute to safety, but injuries often kept him from flying for weeks or months, slowly eroding the pool of experienced veterans whose intuition could not be taught in classrooms. By 1944, new Luftwaffe pilots received fewer than 150 hours of flight training compared to the 250 to 300 hours they had enjoyed earlier in the war. In contrast, American pilots routinely entered combat with more than 300 hours, including extensive time in the exact aircraft they would fly. The gap in training was not merely a matter of skill. It determined survival itself. A pilot with inadequate training died not because he lacked courage, but because he lacked the accumulated experience that kept a veteran alive in a sky ruled by energy angles and timing. In the Pacific Theater, the P-38's unique strengths were showcased most dramatically by Major Richard Bong. Bong refused to engage Japanese Zeros in traditional turning battles. He preserved speed, climbed steeply, and forced the lighter Zero to follow him upward. At 8,000 feet, the Zero kept pace. At 12,000 feet, it began to labor. By 15,000 feet, it approached the edge of aerodynamic stall. The P-38, by contrast, still carried momentum upward. Bong would then roll over the top dive with gravity and horsepower behind him and fire before the Zero could recover. Using this vertical strategy, he achieved 40 aerial victories, becoming America's highest-scoring ace before he died, not in combat but in a test accident involving a jet aircraft at the age of 24. In Europe, Lightning pilots developed parallel strategies tailored to the distinct characteristics of their foes. Against the Bf-109, they lured German pilots into climbing engagements, knowing that altitude would sap the power of the German engines, while the turbocharged Allisons continued to deliver. Against the Focke-Wulf 190, whose radial engine and broad wings offered excellent roll rate and dive performance at medium altitude, American pilots fought above 25,000 feet, where the BMW radial engine's power curve dropped sharply. The P-38 was not perfect. Its size made it an inviting target. Its turning radius was not as tight as smaller fighters. Yet the presence of two engines often saved pilots who would otherwise have been lost. A Lightning with one dead engine could limp home, while a single-engine fighter, in the same condition, often meant a captured or dead pilot. Faced with this expanding American dominance, the Luftwaffe gradually shifted from offensive to defensive habits. New instructions stressed the importance of attacking bombers only when escorts were absent or out of position. Pilots were told to preserve their aircraft whenever possible, disengaging early rather than pressing an attack that carried unacceptable risk. It was a dramatic departure from the bold, aggressive doctrine that had defined the early war years when German fighters had been the predators of the sky. Now they were increasingly forced into the role of cautious defenders, constrained not by lack of will, but by the weakening capacity of their machines and their shrinking pool of trained pilots. Individual heroism could not compensate for structural decline. Aces like Walter Nowotny and Heinz Baer continued to engage American fighters, aggressively scoring impressive numbers of aerial victories. Nowotny amassed 258 kills before dying in November of the year 1944 at the age of 23. Baer, who survived the war with more than 200 victories later, reflected bitterly that Germany had not been defeated because its pilots lacked courage or skill, but because they had been forced to fight outnumbered and increasingly outperformed by an opponent whose industrial and operational capacity dwarfed their own. By the middle of 1944, the strategic situation deteriorated further. The Allied invasion of Normandy stretched German air defences thin across France and the Low Countries. P-38s operated from airfields in England and from newly captured strips on the continent, expanding their reach across occupied Europe. They escorted bombers on deep raids, swept ahead of bomber streams to clear the skies, and struck rail lines, convoys, and ground targets with devastating effect. The aircraft became so omnipresent, so unpredictable, that German pilots began referring to it with a mix of fear and respect as the fork-tailed devil. The name captured the psychological weight of facing a machine that could appear anywhere, at any altitude, with capabilities that seemed to defy the familiar laws of air combat. Desperation drove the Luftwaffe to seek technological salvation. The Messerschmitt Me 262 jet fighter entered service with theoretical performance unmatched by any propeller-driven aircraft. At speeds approaching 550 miles per hour, it could outrun or outclimb any piston-engine opponent. Yet the jet suffered from problems that could not be overcome by raw speed alone. Its engines were fragile, with operational lifespans measured in hours rather than hundreds of hours. They consumed fuel at prodigious rates, leaving pilots only a few minutes of effective combat time. To attack bombers, the jet had to slow down, forfeiting its advantage and becoming vulnerable to escorting fighters. P-38 pilots, recognizing the strengths and weaknesses of the new threat, avoided dogfighting the jet, instead waiting for moments when it was slow and exposed during takeoff or landing. Several Me-262 fighters were destroyed in precisely those vulnerable phases. Only a few hundred jet aircraft ever reached operational service, far too few and far too late to alter the outcome. By the time the fork-tailed devil stalked German skies with near impunity, the transformation was complete. What began as a shock in the thin air above Schweinfurt had evolved into a decisive shift in the balance of power. The P-38 did not merely outperform German fighters, it undermined the assumptions that had once made those fighters formidable. It forced tactical change, strained industrial capacity, exposed training deficiencies, and stripped away the psychological advantage that Luftwaffe pilots had carried into the early years of the war. The Lightning's climb, its range, its resilience, and its ability to fight on terms dictated entirely by its own strengths, marked the beginning of a new era in air warfare, one in which the vertical dimension belonged to the side that understood energy engineering and adaptability more deeply than its opponent. The wartime record of the Lightning, when viewed in raw numbers, already paints an astonishing picture. More than 10,000 airframes rolled out of American factories, a testament to an industrial system capable of sustaining both complexity and scale. In the skies of Europe alone, the aircraft flew well over 130,000 sorties, a figure so immense it almost obscures the individual missions behind it, each flown by a person who trusted the twin Allison engines to pull him home. In air-to-air combat over the European theatre, the Lightning destroyed at least 1,800 German aircraft, ripping holes in the Luftwaffe's defensive shield at moments when the balance of the air war hung precariously in the balance. Yet even these figures, dramatic as they are, fail to capture the deeper shift the aircraft produced. The Lightning did not merely score victories, it changed. The geometry of the air war altered how escort missions were conceived, and introduced a new relationship between altitude, range, and energy that forced the Luftwaffe to rethink principles it had believed immutable. Few men articulated that shift more powerfully than Franz Stigler, whose first encounter with the Lightning had shattered his understanding of aerial physics. After the war, he emigrated to Canada and began work as an aerospace engineer, a role that gave him a vantage point from which to reflect more dispassionately on the machines he had once fought. In an interview conducted in the year 1991, he recalled the early days of the conflict when German pilots were told confidently that American fighters were inferior. He admitted that at first that assessment had been largely correct. The early American aircraft they encountered lacked high-altitude performance, suffered reliability issues, or were simply not optimized for European conditions. But in the Lightning, Stigler saw something fundamentally different. The Americans had not tried to create a better version of the Messerschmitt. They had chosen an entirely different design path, one that prioritized long-range escort and high-altitude combat. Once the Luftwaffe understood that the Americans had solved a different problem entirely, Stigler said they also understood that they could not win. The truth woven through his recollections underscores an essential point: technology is never inherently superior. It is only superior relative to the mission it is designed to accomplish. The Bf-109 was nearly ideal for short-range combat over friendly or contested territory. It could take off, climb quickly at low to medium altitudes, strike with precision, and return home within minutes. It carried enough ammunition for brief, decisive engagements, and when operated inside its optimal envelope, it was deadly. The Lightning, on the other hand, sacrificed some low-altitude agility for capabilities that mattered far more in the actual conditions of the mid-war European sky. It possessed range that reached deep across enemy territory, altitude performance that held firm even above 30,000 feet, redundancy that saved pilots when a single engine failed, and concentrated firepower that could rip apart enemy fighters or tear into the armored hull of a Focke-Wulf. Nowhere was the versatility of the Lightning more evident than in the diverse theatres of World War II. In the Mediterranean, unarmed reconnaissance variants designated F-5 roamed above heavily defended targets carrying cameras in place of machine guns. These aircraft, vulnerable in theory, survived through sheer altitude and speed, slipping through gaps in flak bursts to deliver images essential to Allied planners. In North Africa, the brutal climate posed constant danger to aircraft engines. Sand and dust devoured machinery, yet the twin-engine layout of the Lightning provided a margin of safety. If one engine succumbed to the desert, the other could often keep the aircraft airborne long enough for the pilot to escape disaster. In the China, Burma, India theatre, the Lightning excelled in the thin air over the Himalayan mountains, escorting vulnerable transport aircraft over the treacherous route known as the Hump. At altitudes above 20,000 feet, where many aircraft struggled to breathe, the turbocharged Allisons of the Lightning continued to push confidently upward. These accomplishments, however, did not create a uniform reputation. In the Pacific, where long distances and high-altitude performance were essential, aces revered the aircraft. They celebrated its ability to outclimb opponents, to fight on vertical terms, and to bring them home from missions that would have been suicidal in single-engine fighters. In Europe, the reception was more complicated. Pilots respected the aircraft, but some complained about its temperament in cold weather and the heavy workload required to manage 2 engines and 2 turbochargers. Maintenance crews in England groaned under the complexity of servicing a machine that pushed the limits of pre-war engineering. The criticisms did not stem from flaws in the basic concept, but from the simple reality that complexity carries costs. Those costs eventually opened the door for succession. The arrival of the P-51D Mustang introduced a fighter that matched the Lightning's high-altitude performance while presenting a lighter, simpler single-engine package. Powered by the Packard-built version of the Rolls-Royce Merlin, the Mustang combined efficiency, range, speed, and ease of maintenance in a way that made it the ideal escort for the strategic bombing campaign in its final phases. It did not replace the Lightning because it was conceptually superior, but because it arrived at the right moment with the right balance of performance and simplicity. Yet the Mustang's success does not diminish the legacy of the Lightning. The Mustang followed a trail the Lightning had carved out. It entered a battlefield transformed by the twin-engine pioneer that had forced Germany to confront a new type of warfare. In the years after the conflict, the legacy of the Lightning extended far beyond its wartime missions. The man who had shaped its development, Clarence Kelly Johnson, went on to lead Lockheed's Skunk Works, a secretive division that became synonymous with radical innovation. Under Johnson's leadership, the Skunk Works produced aircraft that defined 20th-century aviation, the U-2 high-altitude reconnaissance plane, the SR-71 strategic reconnaissance aircraft that still holds speed records, and later the F-117 stealth fighter that revolutionized aerial warfare once again. The principles refined in the Lightning, including turbocharging aerodynamic efficiency at high altitudes and design philosophies that challenged conventional assumptions, shaped decades of engineering advances. Even the tactical lessons learned by Lightning pilots endured. The emphasis on vertical energy management, the disciplined use of altitude to control engagement geometry, and the strategic manipulation of climb and dive performance became foundational elements of modern fighter doctrine. But the Lightning's significance reaches beyond engineering and tactics. It serves as a case study of how technological disruption reshapes entire organizations. The aircraft proved that superiority is never permanent. It demonstrated that new capabilities can render old expertise less relevant, undermining doctrines that once seemed unshakable. The Luftwaffe, an organization built on the technological assumptions of 1939, struggled when confronted with the reality of 1943. Its structure, optimized for incremental refinement, could not pivot quickly enough to respond to a radically different threat. The rigidity that had once protected German engineering excellence now slowed adaptation when flexibility was required. In contrast, the United States Army Air Forces benefited from institutional traits that encouraged experimentation. Because it had fewer entrenched pre-war assumptions and access to vast industrial resources, it could afford to pursue multiple unconventional design paths at once. Failures were accepted as part of the process rather than punishable sins. Designs that succeeded were rapidly produced in massive numbers. This environment enabled the development of the Lightning not as an anomaly, but as one among several bold, innovative aircraft that emerged during the war. The experimental culture itself became as decisive as any specific machine. The emotional legacy of the Lightning endures long after the engines fell silent. Today, fewer than a dozen airworthy examples remain. When one rises into the sky during an air show, the synchronized hum of its twin engines and the unmistakable silhouette of its twin booms command the attention of all who watch. Elderly veterans sometimes gather to witness these flights. Former Lightning pilots recall the confidence they felt knowing they could outclimb anything in the European sky. Former opponents speak of frustration, disbelief, and the moment when their assumptions collapsed as the fork-tailed devil soared past them at a climb rate of 3,300 feet per minute. In that moment, they realized that the rules they had trusted for years no longer applied. And so, as the narrative of the Lightning's wartime journey draws to its close, the machine stands not simply as a weapon of its time, but as a symbol of innovation, adaptability, and the transformative power of engineering daring. Its story reminds us that in the realm of technological competition, the greatest shifts occur when someone dares to ask a different question, when established assumptions are set aside, and when a new path is chosen not to imitate what exists but to solve a problem that others have overlooked. Thank you for continuing on this journey. If you wish to explore more deep, detailed histories of aviation's most remarkable machines, the next stories await you.